When Donald Trump obviously first entered, the White House back in 2016, there was a question asked: what impact, what impact will Donald Trump, his actions and his words have on our politics? And really, the great answer to that was not a lot. Not a lot. Because the only real guy who was cast as like the British Trump was Boris Johnson. Obviously, in comes Johnson in 2016, leading the Leave campaign, gets his, absolute surprise win, comes out looking absolutely disheveled, looking, oh my God, what happened here? And then, of course, when everyone is expecting him to go for the leadership, he doesn't go for it, because he knows at that moment in time what an absolute poison chalice it would become. And that's obviously how we ended up with Theresa May, who took that poison chalice and, well, look what happened to her. And I have said at some point, while I do not like Theresa May as a politician, she really did try her best. Really did try her best out of a bad situation. And obviously, as we said right from the beginning, she was trying to please everyone, and in that process, appeased no one. But her backstop idea was ultimately what we probably should have ended up with, had, of course, cooler heads prevailed. And of course, that's not what happened. The Brexiteers, of course, got the DUP involved and, of course, ejected Theresa May, which, of course, finally implemented in Boris Johnson, seeing this as his prime time to try and rise the ranks, of course, of the Tory party. And of course, he did in that election in 2019 somewhat, replicate in some ways a Donald Trump stance. He went out and said, well, I think that there is this whole thing. We saw the whole leveling up, the promise to elevate these left behind areas. And this was what happened to Donald Trump in 2016. He went to these areas, the Rust Belt, and said, you have been forgotten about. You have been ignored. Well, guess what? I am going to be the president that speaks up for you and listens to you. And guess what? He didn't speak to them. He didn't listen to them, nor did he help them. And bear in mind, he played the exact same card again, being, oh, I am Mr. Magnificent when it comes to the economy. Meanwhile, of course, the reality was that Biden has done a lot to actually really help the American economy, and a lot of Trump's, crazy plans that he is going to do will probably end up tanking the American economy. That's just probably what is going to happen, especially when we are expecting in the not too distant future, probably in the next two or 3 weeks, we're probably going to see tariffs come in. We've already seen Mexico and Canada, they have cancelled any future, steel orders. The steel makers up there, we ain't doing any purchasing orders from America because we are expecting tariffs. We are bracing for that to see what has happened. So they are expecting tariffs. However, of course, bring it back, of course, to UK politics. And ultimately, what was the fate of our version of Donald Trump? Well, he wore out his welcome very quickly. Again, he won these left behind areas. Boris spoke. Boris whispered, shall we say, he whispered to these left behind areas, and he managed to get them to dance to his tune. Well, what happened to these left behind areas and the promise, of course, of Tory levelling up? Well, it never happened. Boris, of course, will blame the pandemic. If only the pandemic hadn't happened, then my dreams would have come to fruition. But of course, it was never going to happen. We saw, of course, what happened to the levelling up white paper, where shockingly, the first two chapters were actually quite good, actually laying out the situation of Britain and what actually be needed to be done to level up these left behind communities. And then, of course, we got to chapter 3, which was the Treasury chapter. There, get my teeth in straight there. And of course, Rishi Sunak, to which he went, well, in chapter 2, it said you needed this much. However, I'm only going to give you this much, which was a drop in a bucket of what these places needed, of what, the first two chapters had pretty much said of what they needed. And of course, what happened to leveling up? Well, quite frankly, you were lucky if you actually got everything. The entire system designed around it was more, rather than actually giving places that actually, needed the money, it became more pork barrel politics. That if you happen to have, had a Conservative MP, congratulations, you might get a bit of something. And again, it was really a bit of something. And of course, Trump, or at least Boris here, just like Trump, lied constantly, and he got caught up because our politics did not get Trumpified or Trumpification. It did not go through a Trumpification. Boris kept on lying, and kept on being called out on it, and every single MP in his cabinet kept on being fed up for having to cover for his lies, even while on live television basically said, no, that's a lie, but I've been told this, but no. And they just got fed up. And eventually, he was just thrown out. When the Republicans have had that very similar opportunity to actually get rid of Trump once and for all, they missed their biggest opportunity of impeaching him. They could have got rid of him once and for all. Never had to have dealt with him again. But of course, they didn't do that. Because they were scared of his following. They were terrified of him. It's why even now many Republicans will still dance to his tune, even though they know some of the stuff he's asking for is pretty bad. And I've said this, in this Trump administration, you will probably see how far some of those Republicans are willing to go, because they know he's not going to get a third term. Well, some Republicans would like him to, of course, have a third term. Whether they'll actually get that through is another question. But some know this is it. That after about maybe 2 years, Trump might lose the Senate, or he might lose the House. So that will make him a complete lame duck. So after that, hey, we can actually start speaking out against Trump because we don't have to fear him anymore. Sure, he might be a big influence on our party again, but he can't run for election. He can't, be in the party anymore. So it will be interesting to see what happens there. How long they are, shall we say, willing to stick by Trump on that part. But so far, our politics hasn't been Trumpified. But I did see this morning that, of course, in The Guardian, Andrew Worsley did ask this question. If now that Trump has returned, will our politics enter a re-Trumpification? Well, it didn't during his first term. I doubt it's going to be affected by his second term. However, he did have something very interesting to say about the Tories on this, because, as I've said before, the Tories are split when it comes to Trump. Should they support him? Should they not? Should they actually learn anything from him? Should they just, not even touch him with a 10-foot barge pole? And this was what apparently a senior Tory said to him. They said, My party will say that it is now in the national interest that this relationship is good while doing our best to make it bad. Yeah, that comes apparently straight from a Tory on the Trump-Starmer relationship. Oh, it's in our best national interest to do that, but actually, we're going to try and make it as bad as we possibly can. And then he continues on to say this. The Tories, of course, for a certain bent, Trump's return to the White House is very inspirational. Can it actually, uh, can he actually come back despite everything? Then why not for them? For the hard rightists now of the reform variety, or of course in the Conservative Party, lessons of his comeback is what they are now learning to try and borrow from his tactics to become more Trumpian themselves. Should they also be said, in fact, and I can actually find that these people are very close to the Prime Minister who actually fret about the impact of the shape of British politics of Trump's second term. If it is seen as a success, will it actually, what if it actually works? One senior Labour figure actually recently worried to me. I don't think it's going to work. I think Trump is a bull in a china shop. He's going to break so many things. There is a lot of loyalty and of the positions you have seen gone on in here. He ain't going to, loyalty is not the best thing to have. We saw what happened for that ourselves under Boris Johnson. And then he talks about the more moderate Tories. So at this very same time, I've also now come across moderate Tories who see the significant peril for their party in being beguiled by Trumpery. I like that word, Trumpery. He isn't, of course, just a problem for Labour. He poses dilemmas and dangers now for the Tories as well, who was now representing the British Conservatives at the inauguration. It was the only Brit with a seat in the rotunda was, of course, Boris Johnson, who is also, more importantly, the only British Prime Minister to be forced out of the Commons for lying to it. Liz Truss didn't even make the cut, but she did turn up in Washington anyway to now gurn for the cameras whilst wearing red MAGA hats. Hers, of course, you don't need reminding, was such a calamitous reign that she became the shortest serving British Prime Minister in history of the office. A sight now of this utterly discredited duo now jostling for attention in DC was very wince-making for any Conservative who hopes that voters can now be induced to try and forget the rotten things they did when they were in power when they last possessed it. So, while I do not think our politics is going to get Trumpified or go through a Trumpification, just otherwise you would have seen that last time that it didn't happen. And we had almost a very personification of Trump in Boris Johnson. We had that very personification in Boris Johnson this time, or at least last time. We don't this time. It's very different. Kimmy Badnock might try, but when she went over to America and did this really cringe-inducing speech, which made conservative cringe, which is incredibly hard to do, then yeah, I don't think, once again, the culture wars is going to get transposed into the UK politics, which is, again, Kimmy Badnock's greatest hope, because that is all she's good at, which a lot of people in the Conservative Party are now finding out. So you are going to see, I think, those two brands of conservative, one at least hoping, oh, well, you see, if Donald Trump can make such a miraculous comeback, well, so too can we, because again, we just weren't conservative enough. And that brand of conservatism will go straight off a cliff edge at some point. Meanwhile, the more moderate conservatives are more worried about the Trumpification of their party. They're more worried about that. Yes, they do not want to see that happen because they've seen what has happened. They don't want people to be reminded, of course, about Boris Johnson, about Liz Truss. They want to try and, move away from that era as much as they can without reminding the British public too much. And the thing is, if they do try for a trumpeting of the party under Kimmy Badenoch or even Robert Jerrick a couple of years down the line, or maybe even next year, depending how long Kimmy Badenoch lasts, you know, people are going to be reminded, hey, you're sounding an awful lot like Boris Johnson or even Liz Truss. How well is that going to go down with the British voting public next time around? I don't think it's going to go well at all. So let me know what you think. Do you think that Trump's return might herald a Trumpification of British politics? I don't think it will again. Otherwise, we'd have seen that. Will we see a, Farage take lessons from Donald Trump? But as I've said before, Farage has a ceiling. He's not going to break through it. And we've seen that in the by-elections. Bear in mind, 180 plus by-elections since the general election, Reform have only won 7. So for all the talk of their popularity electorally, it's very poor. It's very poor. So, as always, let me know what you think down below in the comments. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.